this rule by four, symbolized in a statue where the four emperors are hugging each other. They're in an eternal embrace. And so this was the ideal in Rome that could not be achieved, which is one of the reasons that the Western Empire fell. But it is a kind of guiding commandment for Americans. And it seems as though, and this is how I would put it, that Americans have made their will felt.
This is the Friends of History Debating Society. I'm Gaius. Germanicus is here. We have a cup of wine. It's wintertime in Londinium. The Thames is turbulent. So is the market crowd. There's news from Rome that our unpopular emperor Domitian, that's the Flavian dynasty, is even more unpopular than we remember. News doesn't come through commonplacely, but when we hear it, we worry about it. We're far from Rome on purpose. We're equus class. We don't get involved with the Senate. We can't afford it. And we especially can't afford to attract attention. But the Domitian reign might be closing in on the final years. At the same time, we have opportunity to forget our troubles here in Londinium and look to the 21st century. Rich events these last days, tragic, at the same time compelling, because they make it very attractive for us to connect 21st century American Republic to first century Roman Empire. We begin with the big theme, fire. Immediately when I heard and started reporting on the fires of Los Angeles, I didn't think of Nero right away as compelling as much as I thought of Crassus. Now, Crassus was a member of the triumvirate. Caesar, Pompey the Great, and Crassus had divided up the republic among themselves and were happy to rule with some balance. And then Crassus and his son went off on an expedition to the east and were circled, ambushed, and destroyed. That very much set Pompey and Caesar on a crash course. We know that led to the Civil War, and that led to Augustus, our emperor, the man who founded the empire. In the meantime, though, it's important to say Crassus was a member of the triumvirate, not because he was especially adept at the field, hence his defeat and murder by savages as a measure of how he wasn't a battler. He wasn't a commander like Caesar and Pompey. But he was powerful because he was the richest man in Rome, actually the richest man in the solar system at the time. And how did he make his money? He bought up the destroyed parts of Rome after a fire. He bought up distressed property and then rebuilt it or didn't and sold it for an enormous profit. There was even remarks, I don't account for them, but I pass them on, that Crassus had agents who helped along the fires if they were avoiding some particular piece of real estate like the Palatine Hill that he fancied for resale. Now, Germanicus, a very good evening to you. This is defaming Crassus, who I celebrate as a very wealthy man. It is striking, however, how another wealthy man has come to dominate the conversation with the new emperor, Mr. Trump. Fire is a theme that runs through first century AD Rome, and we know that it will be commonplace against this, through the cities of Europe for the next 2,000 years. Crassus I thought of. I did not think of Nero. Let's settle this right away. Suetonius says Nero set the fire, just like Crassus set fires. Will you accept that? Good evening to you, Germanicus.
Good evening, Gaius. We can accept in our lofty and really far removed and thus secure station, we can accept anything we want. The truth is that the ancient city was always a tinderbox. And I should say not necessarily the ancient cities of stone. And of course, the Greeks built of stone, and so did the Romans, because there wasn't really much timber. But cities became increasingly combustible the larger they got. And the problem that Rome faced, and that would be faced by, you know, Greek Romans in Constantinople centuries hence, was the fact that truly large cities can create a conflagration that no one can contain. And, Rome in the time of Nero was not quite 1 million people, but it was certainly the largest city on this side of China or India. And it was extremely vulnerable to fire. And archaeologists and historians really do finger Nero as seeing the fire as to his advantage. And whether he set it purposely or as an act of state, it does seem that the fire was part of his plan for greater things, maybe greater things for himself. But I have to remind that the great fires that took over the megacities of antiquity were hard to avoid ultimately, and there were many of them.
I'm keen on pressing this idea that cities were remade by fire. It is said that Crassus was always building improved residences. He didn't build slums. He was always looking to make a buck, a fast buck. And he was very good at it. He was extremely rich, hence his power. Nero's motive, if Suetonius is accurate, and who knows, Suetonius had his own motives. Nero's ambition was not riches. He was the emperor, after all. It was, in some fashion, theatrical. He saw himself as creating a city that was worthy of his performance. Hence the Golden House, which we can only guess at the scale of it.
Well, there's some reconstructions. It's absolutely unbelievable for the ancient world that one could live in such a magnificent place. It was, well, go ahead.
Well, what I'm getting to is that Nero has 2,000 years later, has the flavor of being a lightweight. He was not a lightweight. He was a man who had a vision that was theatrical. Perhaps it wasn't impressive at the time because he wasn't a warrior emperor.
Mm-hmm.
He was an actor emperor. In fact, I recall the last years of his life, he went off to Greece to win all the prizes at the games, at the Olympic Games, because they had prizes for singers and dancers and actors at the time.
Well, Commodus would later do that in the arena at the Colosseum. It was trying to live up to the heroic, prototype from the Odyssey of Achilles. It was all about trying to be the new Achilles. So I can understand Nero trying to, perform that, and as Commodus or anyone else. But I mean, this was one of the great burdens of the ancient world. But getting back to these cities, Nero had, if we're to take this theatrical concept and extend it 2,000 years ahead, we see a kind of theatrical management and administration.
Well connected.
California.
Connected, Germanicus. Very nicely done. Please continue.
No. It's very important because everything about Mr. Newsom and all of his minions, all of his little dweebs who've been Caligula had a horse who was made senator. Well, people were put into various positions in much the same way. Obviously, they weren't horses, but they had zero capacity or zero authority to step into demanding jobs. And the result was you had a performative California run as a kind of DEI theater for the last decade and more, and it's all come home. The chickens have come home to roost.
Mel Gibson lost his house in Malibu, I believe, and his comment to Mr. Rogan was that he should tell the governor to use less hair gel. Now, I'm not quite sure how that adds up, but apparently the governor has a reputation for combing his locks with artificial means. That's what I mean. That's what I take it. This has
Yeah.
long been true. I was unaware of the hairstyle.
Well, answer me this. How could the mini emperor, because that's what he is, given the fact that this is a state in a federal system, how could this mini emperor have during COVID feasted like some Roman, like Nero, at a place that was called the French Laundry? I mean, it is beyond hyperbole. It is beyond the capacity of.
All right, let me come to the hard question. Does he remain a candidate for 28 for the Democrats?
Democrats have a very long, hard road. It's like the road to Damascus. It
They
is.
appreciate actors.
They appreciate the world that they have lived in, which is a false world. They've lived in a world of performative possibility because they were in control, and because they were in control, they could then allow themselves to enter into uh, something that was not possible, something that no person in a position of responsibility over a great empire should ever take for granted. And yet they had this noblesse oblige, this hauteur, that somehow they were the gods and they could do whatever they wished.
I
And
take that as a yes,
this,
you believe he's a candidate.
well, as they
Let's
say, well,
let's turn to the gathering of emperors then, because there's a nice mix available at the National Cathedral, a Roman basilica with Christianity abounding, and the gathering of the emperors from all sides of the equation in these last days. Germanicus is Michael Vlahos. I am Gaius. We're in Londinium. We're finding many connections between the events of the 21st century, especially these last days, and our Roman first century, our model for success. We're here in Londinium because we don't want to be caught up in the plots in Rome, but we know that the second century is going to be extremely successful. In fact, our Roman Empire will reach its pinnacle in the early years of the second century AD. And 2,000 years later, the United States of America is successful because it uses the Roman Empire as a model. What about the emperors? Conveniently, the emperors all staged a gathering in a basilica for us these last days to pay last respects to a previous emperor, Jimmy Carter of Georgia. And gathering in one place in an easy camera shot was a mix of Republicans and Democrats of the last, well, Mr. Carter reaches back to the 1970s, but sitting and in respect to Mr. Carter was Mr. Clinton, Mr. Bush, Mr. Obama, Mr. Biden, and Mr. Trump, president-elect, all in one place. Germanicus, it was a treat to witness these emperors together because the magic of the throne has left them exempt from many ordinary considerations. They float above the Roman remains, the remains of the empire, and they each have opinions of where we are here in the 21st century. But I want to speak to the general picture of them all together. What did you make of it? Is the empire successful to have these veterans sitting together?
It must be said, given our own experience in our own time, that it is something of a success, certainly for the purposes of achieving long-term stability, that rival emperors can meet each other, not just rival emperors, but former emperors. And the fact that emperors don't have to kill each other in order for there to be an authoritative succession is something of an achievement. And I think that is perhaps the great achievement of the American Empire, because you had all the emperors there pretending to, be amicable and civil, but in fact, for all of their hatred of each other, they all adhere to this covenant, this kind of framework of civility that, in effect, forms a kind of conceptual framework for Americans, and it is a framework that Americans absolutely rely upon. America was very much adrift after 2020 because the authority of the succession and the civility that you saw in the Washington Cathedral was abrogated for a short period of time. And that short period of time led to great distress in the nation. And that's been resolved, but it's been resolved through contretemps, meaning conflict and upheaval that Americans don't want to see again. So, in many ways, you could say that this ritual convocation was a way for the emperors to reaffirm that, yes, they sign on to this and will adhere to this into the future. And the best affirmation of that was the kind of small but highly regarded, meaning everyone saw it, concordat between Mr. Obama and Mr. Trump. It was a tiny moment, but it signaled that, hey, we're not going to go there again, meaning we're not going to go back to the near chaos that was occasioned by the coming apart in 2020. Not the complete coming apart, but it was very unsettling to Americans. Americans do not want that. The emperors know that. The emperors got together. They acted. Okay, so let's get back to some time that we can appreciate, which would be the 290s, maybe 300, 310s. There's a wonderful statue in basalt of the four emperors, because the empire was divided by Diocletian. There were two emperors, there were two co-emperors. And you have this tetrarchy, this rule by four, symbolized in a statue where the four emperors are hugging each other. They're in an eternal embrace. And so this was the ideal in Rome that could not be achieved, which is one of the reasons that the Western Empire fell. But it is a kind of guiding commandment for Americans. And it seems as though, and this is how I would put it, that Americans have made their will felt, and it shows in that very sacred ritual of the, commemoration of another emperor.
Does it mean that you mentioned performative before? Does it mean that it's all for show? That when they're on the stage and the curtains are pulled back and they speak harshly and they condemn, that is not real?
This is a tremendous question on your part, Gaius, because I think that blue and the old establishment of red kind of lost their way. But blue, especially in its strange behavior in the last 12 years, with the fantasies of the progressive movement and all that attended it in terms of the Church of Woke, they came to believe that they could do whatever they wanted and they could do anything that was performative and people would buy it. But people don't buy anything on the basis of a stage presentation. What people look to in sacred civic ritual is they look to a reassurance of continuity and that the abiding elements of our way of life and our social compact and the ultimate political efflorescence of that, which is the Constitution, and the rituals that flow from that Constitution. That is what they want. And what I think has happened in California over the last 10 years is ample testament to what happens when you replace sacred ritual with theatricality as a way of covering a venal departure from the norms that people expect and need.
Mr. Trump, the emperor, eminent emperor, again, is a performance artist, and a performance artist who has great skill at both inspiring people and enraging his opponents. There are observations that his success in 2024 was a result of his enraging his opponents more than inspiring his supporters.
Well, he called out their abrogation of the ultimate essence of the political compact, which I believe is not simply to be found in administration and legislation, but in ritual continuity. And he understands ritual. He may be, called out for being a buffoon, but he understands the desires of Americans to have this kind of ritual sacred compact. And the fact that that has all sorts of strange manifestations, even back in the day when he was appearing in the WWF, that is a form, strangely, of a kind of customary civic ritual because it bound people together from a certain class, and he understood that, and he bonded with these people. And these people have elected him president in an unexampled way. And so I think just as Reagan understood this, just as FDR did, and just as Teddy Roosevelt did, and Lincoln, et cetera, and Andrew Jackson, he understands this need for binding ritual and the way in which it can pull people together. And there is an incredible existential divide between the sacred ritual of American identity and the American ethos on one hand, and on the other, performative masking rituals that are intended to push a very different agenda that people don't want. I think that was in one way of putting the last election.
Is Mr. Trump self-aware of this?
Well, you could ask Reagan as well. I think those are two men who understand at a deep level, but they may not be able to articulate it for the New York Review of Books.
Gaius and Germanicus, and we're in Londinium, we're philosophizing, and it has come up that the emperor-to-be, we're in an interregnum now for these next days. The emperor-to-be has identified two locations, Greenland and Panama, as necessary to defend America from its adversaries. Panama is a rich story dating back to TR more than 100 years ago, and we will address that in coming weeks. There's lots of time. Say that when it was handed off by Mr. Carter You had all the elements together sitting in the front two benches in the basilica. Mr. Carter present, his soul in heaven, and all of these elements were not able in their time and today to solve giving away Panama. We'll leave that. I want to turn to Greenland because this is a landmass that is very much part of the story of global warming, also the story of colonial power. Denmark is the possessor of Greenland in terms of sovereignty. Mr. Trump has said, we're going to buy Greenland. My opinion as a Roman is, okay, take it. If you need it, take it. Might of Rome requires defenses. We guarantee, we Romans, civilization. If we give up our understanding of civilization, that means we've given up our understanding of power, of authority. Germanicus, you know this case very well. I'm struck by the Europeans, our allies these years, forgetting that we put them back together twice. Well, once completely. The first time we were regretful that we'd gotten involved. Put them together twice, and they're sitting around aghast at our rudeness in wanting Greenland. How do you measure the Europeans, our allies? Are they our allies, or are they kibitzers in a power game?
Well, when you have small children, they can create all sorts of issues when they're told they can't do something or when they feel that they need or want something. And I only say that not as condescension, but simply the fact that Europe, especially in the wake of 3 years of a proxy war with Ukraine, Europe has become a collection of vassal states of the U.S. And as such, they have no real say in whatever we choose to do. It's rather harsh and arbitrary, but it's very Roman. Now, there's a huge backstory to Greenland, and the backstory goes back to the German Nazi invasion of Denmark, if you want to call it that. It was more like a benign occupation. But the fact is that that occupation occasioned a response by our president, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, to declare that Greenland was part of North America, which in geological terms it is, in terms of plate tectonics and the rest. But the fact is that the U.S. was able to secure, through the Danish ambassador in Washington, an agreement with the chiefs of Greenland that they wanted the U.S. to be their guardian and that they would declare independence. So the independence of Greenland is not something new, and it's not something that the U.S. has insinuated darkly and inequitably. It is something that is deeply in the legacies of Greenland. And Greenland has been essentially an extension of American military power since World War II. And if you look at all of the ways in which the U.S. defended Greenland, there were Nazi weather stations in Greenland, and actually the biggest threat to Greenland in World War II were not the Germans. They were the British and Canadians on one hand, and the Norwegians on the other, because they had a prior claim to Greenland that had been settled in 1931, but they still wanted it. And so I would say that the U.S. is perfectly positioned to find a way to incorporate Greenland more closely into the U.S. Now, there's some wrinkles here, but one of the interesting precedents to the U.S. incorporating a Danish possession is the purchase of what are now the U.S. Virgin Islands from Denmark in 1917. And if you look at the negotiations to that treaty, where we paid Denmark $25 million, they were concerned that they didn't want to bear the burden of supporting the Virgin Islands in the future. And it's very interesting that they were so readily amenable and ready to sell the thing. And it's been a part of the U.S. And frankly, given its population, if we make Greenland, say, a state, then we'll soon have to make Virgin Islands, Samoa, Guam,
No,
Northern
we're
Mariana
looking, we're
States.
looking at, not at it as a state. We're looking at it as a possession. Like the,
Well, a possession could be a territory, but the likelihood is there'll be some halfway house in which Greenland will become a kind of wholly owned subsidiary of the U.S. that isn't formally or legally made a territory of the U.S., which would create difficulties, but rather a kind of autonomous stakeholder state that has a bosom relationship with us. I don't know what that would be, but there are many legal possibilities that could be overlaid on this. We could certainly compensate Denmark handsomely, and the difficulty, of course, is to provide for protection for the inhabitants of Greenland. There are only a little more than 50,000 of them, but also we also need to find a way to extend this formal security umbrella, and in a way, my guess would be that the security relationship would be the stalking horse for Greenland being essentially an extension of the US. So it doesn't have to be, oh, it's another state or even a territory, because you have to remember there are invidious and negative associations with territorial status. Think of Puerto Rico, for example, or think of the situation of the Philippines after the Spanish-American War. We don't want to go there. And frankly, also, as I just mentioned a few seconds ago, you've got Samoa, Guam, Northern Marianas, Puerto Rico. I mean, you don't want to get into that, because then that brings up all sorts of rather raw political issues in terms of status. But there is no impediment that I can see.
oh, your thumbs up.
Yeah, of
All
course.
right. All right. I was getting to it. I don't worry about impediments.
Well, look at a map. Look at a map. There's a
We did
huge
what we want.
struggle over the Arctic, and the U.S. has Arctic engagement
Oh,
now.
I'm convinced. You,
Alaska.
you
Yes,
don't
I
need to
know.
sell me, Germanicus.
What I'm trying to say is there is such precedent, there's such a backstory that it should not be a difficulty. And it's certainly not a difficulty in terms of the interests of Greenlanders, which we have to fully respect and fulfill.
Hesitate about that word respect. There are 50,000 people there. They want to make a deal. We can make every one of them a millionaire.
Well, we should, but we still have to respect. I mean, do you respect North Dakota? I mean, come on.
I know the difference between opportunity and respect. And right now, opportunity is enough. I'm I'm most taken with the European reaction. I listened to a podcast from the Financial Times. They don't seem to have
No.
understood how America works. This is the British Empire, what remains of it.
Okay. Well, I mean, what you said is absolutely right. But there is, I think, an equally massive element of not getting it. They don't get their position. They don't get the situation that they inhabit. And they really need to get with the program.
Not going to happen, Germanicus.
No, it's not. Well, it's not
Our
going to happen until
lifetimes.
all the governments fall. That could happen in the next several years, but maybe it
Uh,
will.
There is a political wind blowing.
But it could just be a mighty wind, as they say.
All right, I'm just mentioning a trend that the FT mentions now and again.
Now, listen,
For
listen.
Deutschland, National Rally, the Brotherhoods of Italy,
Yeah, I know.
Warm Party in London. It's beginning to look like make Europe great again.
Well, I think they want that. And the US under Mr. Trump could certainly ride that wave and take advantage of that. Now, just getting back to your point about opportunity and respect, respect is the easiest thing to extend in order to secure opportunity. And that's the bottom line. I make you an offer you can't refuse.
Okay. Okay, fine. The end result is we want Greenland, we take it.
Oh, well, one more thing I need to say is that the war in Ukraine is on the verge of collapse. The terrors of the proxy war are going to need cover. Now, if the US was able to expand by including an island of 864,000 square miles of incredible mineral wealth, that would cover the fact that we engaged in a worthless and tragic war, corralling Ukraine into a national self-sacrifice that will haunt us forever. I mean, this is the kind of thing that, if you're speaking just politically, would be a godsend to the new administration.
Germanicus is Vlahos. I am Gaius, John Batchelor. We're going to the theater. We sacrificed to Augustus. And then we're headed to the theater, where tonight there's recitation of poetry by Sappho. Sappho was a cagey political actor on the island of Lesbos with a prominent political family. And very successful in her life. She founded a school. She was jealous of her rivals, and she left a great legacy. At the same time, I mentioned that we Romans have a way of undermining her authority by telling a romantic tale that Aeneas landed on the island in his travels from Troy and on his way to founding Rome. And the story is that Sappho and Aeneas fell immediately in love, deeply in love. And when Aeneas left, his destiny was not on Lesbos. The story is that Sappho threw herself off a cliff. Now, the Greeks don't like this. The Romans do. I mentioned, I'm not here to settle it. It occurs to me that somewhere in the poetry reading tonight, we might get a clue as to what the present thinking is. Your final 30 seconds, Germanicus. You have insights on the Greeks. Do they understand that the Romans are trying to undermine Sappho, and will they push back?
The Greeks were defeated by the Romans, and then starting with Cynocephalae, maybe even going back to Pyrrhus. But the Greeks, having been defeated by the Romans, conquered by them, they then took over Rome,
Right.
which they did with complete and absolute success.
It sounds to me like they won't mind because they have a smile on their face. This is the Friends of History Debating Society. In Londinium, I'm John Batchelor.